What's up, guys? Welcome to another edition of Before the Whistle presented by BRK Insurance Group. If your business is looking for the best in employee benefits, commercial property and casualty insurance, or retirement and 401k plan services, there's no one better suited to meet your challenges and build a plan centered around your needs than BRK Insurance Group. What's going on, y'all? Welcome back to Before the Whistle again. I'm your host, Maddy Hudak, and I'm very excited to break down Tulane spring game this past weekend. One that I think if anyone was there or saw any of the photos in attendance, was a little bit of a shock to the senses, just how much interest there really is in this 2024 Tulane football team, where I think the university did a great job of really integrating that event with giveaways throughout the game for fans that got there early, having a warehouse sale with the apparel outside, and then Crawfest going on right over there just made it a lot easier for fans to get there. But scrimmage kicked off at 10 a.m. for this weekend's spring game, and I got there at about 9:05, and the Claiborne lot was not only full, but there was a line coming out of it. I quickly pulled a Yui and was able to squeeze into a spot in Diebold, but I was really taken aback that the entirety of that lot was full an hour before the spring game. And I do remember the game last year. There was a decent amount of people that showed up there. I want to say it was maybe 1,000 people, but that was a huge difference from, I guess I really actually hadn't been at the spring game the year prior, my first season. The Cotton Bowl year, there was really no one at the spring game at all because the perception was that the team was still that 2-10 team at the time. So we got a little bit of interest drummed up at last year's spring game, but there are people that are saying, and I'm inclined to believe them as an attendee of one or two games at the Superdome, that spring game was attended better than some of those home games a couple decades ago for the Green Wave, where there was probably 5,000 to 7,000 fans there. The entirety of the Glazer Club sections just really filled with people, and you can hear them actually cheering and making defense chants, which I heard you guys at the spring game. So I will be hearing you guys again come this fall when Tulane is on defense to be making that same type of noise. But I just pulled everything together, I think, on all the anticipation around this offseason and looking into this new era of Green Wave football and this new coaching staff and a new team, new identity, new quarterback, what have you. So that was really just beyond cool to see. And it's hard to ignore the effect of that on guys that were there, looking to potentially transfer, looking as potential recruits, and people just looking on and seeing those images. I mean, the interest is as high as it's been since I've been the sideline reporter in spring camp. And the play on the field certainly showed that. I'm going to go through a little bit of a play-by-play here, breaking down this game, but I've tried to kind of learn how to do a podcast episode, and I'll kind of get into that journey as I go throughout this show. But there's just so many things to break down here, and now we're kind of in this off-season period where I'm going to kind of get back into my format of last year where I look at things, a little bigger in football, philosophical things, what have you. But I think a lot of those things can be tied back to what we're seeing really take place at Tulane, just in terms of learning leadership, what it takes to be a starting quarterback, what it takes to come in and take over a program that is going at full speed and keep that running, and what that really looks like, especially in the era of the transfer portal and all of these crazy things. So I don't want to just jump all over the place and not really get to the things that I want to really get to in this episode. But obviously the quarterback competition is what everyone's really trying to pay attention to. And I'm going to try to give as measured of a take as I can possible on that section. But compared to last weekend, where you didn't really have a great feeling about the role of quarterback based on the play on the field, you definitely saw a bounce back in that aspect. And what you're seeing is a legitimate competition. People might not like to hear that, but the fact of the matter is we are in the midst of one, and we're going to see that play out through fall camp. So seeing how that really played out. And I did some charting here and there. I think you're getting a good sense of who the receiving corp is going to be, but the amount of tight end involvement is really hard for me to ignore at this point. Even in the case of Alex Bauman being out recovering from off-season surgery on a sports hernia, the entirety of spring camp, they really ramped up the tight end usage. And when they did, it tended to open up a little bit of the offense as well. So I'm going to go through that. I know that some of these position groups have taken some hits here and there with some guys entering the transfer portal today. Such is a life, and such is what happens after the spring game, where coaches sit down with guys and give them a realistic outlook. A lot of the time when you see guys entering the transfer portal at this stage, it's something that's in the best interest of both sides. If a guy is looking for more playing time, looking for a trajectory that's just not there, that's why you have these conversations, and then that's kind of what you see take place. So breaking all of that down, breaking down what you can really just expect out of this Green Wave offense, and what I think the scoring system for this team in this spring game really showed, being able to really get a sense of the ones versus the ones, but seeing what the offense does when they were in a hole. And I think that's really where you saw a lot of the competition come out from that group in particular. I think you're seeing the defense really start to form together, and you're seeing guys play their way onto the field. And Rishi Ratan is probably one of the best examples of the next man up mentality going on this team. And just kind of what something like that, where we've seen a guy go from a walk-on to garnering the attention to get a scholarship, running with the ones now 2 weeks in a row and making several plays on the day at that. Just some standouts for this game all around the board. But I just felt like when you really got to see these guys sit down, get these drives going, you got to see a little bit of what they were made of. You finally saw a little bit of that command and that poise on the offensive side of the ball. But I think it's safe to say that the defense is ready to kind of run forward. And we're going to get into all of that today on this episode. So let's just do a state of before the whistle, shall we? And just kind of where I'm at this point in the offseason and how I'm going to really try to cover both this game and the offseason here moving forward. When I started this show, I always think back to one of the earlier guest episodes I did with one of my very good friends, Ross Jackson. For those of you that listen to this that are Saints fans, I'm sure you all have heard of him, the host of Locked On Saints, one of my very good friends and one of my earlier guests here on this podcast. And I always think back to our conversation about, quite frankly, creating a podcast and an episode and how to structure it and keep people really engaged in your train of thought, and the idea of things being unconscious to subconscious to unconscious when you're trying to learn a new skill or work on something. And I think a lot of the time about my eye contact here, where that was something I struggled with quite a bit to start off this show. And I was unaware of it at the time. So when you're trying to work on the skill, you're super aware of it. And it's something that sometimes affects your delivery. But I've really gotten to the point where it's become second nature at this point. So that's kind of what a year of doing this will really do for you. But now I've also had a year of breaking down a lot of different things on this podcast, be it practices, post-game, life, football, coaching changes, what have you. And I've learned along the way what to do and what not to do. I think it's very important to know yourself first and foremost. I've talked a lot recently. I've had a few Tulane students interview me that have found my profile for class. I've spoken to a few of those classes, and really just knowing yourself, knowing how you operate as a person, I think is really the most important thing in life. Knowing your own strengths and weaknesses and being able to do self-evaluation, to me, is super important. The reason that I always loved writing was it was a very good way for me to express myself, but it was also something that I could come back to. I could sit down in one setting and usually just kind of write out in a flurry and then look back, cut my thinking down a little bit. It's not really the same on a podcast. I am talking in one fell swoop, and people are listening versus reading that on a page. So you have to kind of go differently with the way you approach stuff. I can't just get on here and start reading off a bunch of stats in the way that I could just post a table in an article. And I know a lot of you watch this video, so I could put things up here, but this is also an audio format. All of that to say, I'm learning along the way the best way in which to break down these things for you guys. And knowing the way my brain works, knowing that I have ADHD, I have a tendency to get on tangents, as I'm ironically doing about this exact thing right now. And so when I try to cover everything at once, I don't really actually feel like I get into the weeds about things that I really wanted to talk about at all. So for one, I am at minimum, I'm separating both sides of the ball, starting off going into this breakdown. So I think I'm really going to focus on the offensive side of things in today's episode, talk a little bit about what the scoring was like on the defensive side and what we really saw kind of come out of that. But I just kind of want to focus just on that for now, and really kind of focus on this quarterback competition, because let's be honest, that's really where everyone's brains are looking. That's where everyone is kind of looking to get into the weeds of all of this. And, the first scrimmage that we had, it was super exciting. There were several well-thrown passes. It was just really explosive and exciting in that aspect, but both quarterbacks just kind of making some unforced errors here and there. And then we get into the second scrimmage, and you're hoping to get kind of an idea about a lot of position groups all over the field for that matter. But you're really wanting one of those guys to kind of make that next jump. And I think we saw a total of, let me just pull this up to make sure I have it correct. Yeah, I saw 7 total passes completed between the two guys vying for that top role in Ty Thompson and Kai Horton 2 Saturdays ago at that penultimate scrimmage. And I, at that point, started kind of talking about Darian Mensah. As I've said, I've covered quarterback competitions before. It is a thankless job, no matter who you are speaking about. But I think a lot of people had an idea of what they thought this was going to look like coming into spring. And I think, it just speaks to perhaps unfair pressures and expectations of a guy that you've never really actually seen play in a Tulane uniform. You haven't seen this offense come together. You haven't seen him play as a starter. You're going off of acumen, recruit rankings, and everything like that. And is that perhaps warping the perception of what they're expected to be able to do? And then on the flip side with Kai Horton, are you expecting perhaps a little too much out of the couple of starts that he has and sitting behind Michael Pratt on the bench? Probably the answer lies a little bit in the middle and somewhere in between. But if you're having a real competition, that kind of stuff doesn't matter. And that's where I point to Rishi Rattan on defense. If I'm going to talk about anything on that side of the ball, it's going to be him really playing his way into, at this point, that starting corner role. We'll see what happens in the transfer portal. But Jon Sumrall has made it very clear that clout, perception, whatever, it really doesn't matter. And that's all erased going into this year, going into every single position group. And to me, that's really the best way to go about it. And when you see it happen at all positions, it just breeds that type of good competition. But to me, if you're having a competition, then you're having a real one. And when two guys are in it and aren't pulling away, that's where I'm inclined to look at a guy like Darian Mensah, who was putting together drives in that scrimmage setting and has done enough with his leadership and it just caught my eye and intrigued me. And then I know we all saw the Welcome to Uptown special where they had all those 3 quarterbacks in there. And it's exciting to think about the fact that there are 3 possible starters for the Wave. But coming out of last weekend's scrimmage, you didn't really have a great feeling about either of the 2 top guys leading the race, because quarterback isn't just about completing the passes on the field. Everyone that's a Tulane fan, I don't really think I have to explain all the things that went into making Michael Pratt such a great quarterback. And you're not seeing necessarily all of those traits come out from those guys quite yet, but especially not this last weekend. Something that I also think is really important to keep in mind in these scrimmages, as I was talking with Shawty Clayton Johnson, who was held out of the scrimmage, he was just a little banged up here and there, is, the defense at this point is relatively familiar with the calls that the offense is running. There's only so much surprise you can really put on them. That really is something to keep in mind, that I think the defense is just always going to have a little bit of an edge in that aspect. And, when we see a lot of these motion plays, these jet sweep things not really go well in a spring camp setting, I think a lot of the immediate reaction is, well, don't do that anymore. That play clearly doesn't work. I think the defense is just really used to sniffing it out. So that's why you have spring. That's why you have multiple practices. That's why you have scrimmage and practice and spring camp and a fall camp, because things are going to go back and forth. Defenses are going to have the edge in some facets, but you wanted to come into this scrimmage and you really wanted to see a guy at quarterback start stacking the days and make a real case, because otherwise that's where you do leave the door open for that third guy in the race. And I think after this weekend's scrimmage, it's pretty safe to say that it's realistically between Ty Thompson and Kai Horton, but that doesn't mean that Darian Mensah should be discounted in this whatsoever. You have to think about the long-term nature of the quarterback position. You have to think about development, but we've also, as Tulane fans, very, very quickly seen exactly how Kai Horton made it onto the field in the first place as QB3. Both years that he was quarterback. The Cincinnati game that he came in, the 2021 season, he came into that game because Justin Ibieta had hurt himself in the Morgan State game in week 2. The Houston game the season after that, Justin Ibieta is still ahead of him on the depth chart. He gets hurt in the first drive of the series of the game. So suddenly, again, Guy Horton, QB3, has very quickly become QB1. And you were also seeing that really quickly happen. Darian Mensah was the backup quarterback for the second half of the Military Bowl with Justin Ibieta going down and being hurt. So it goes to show how quickly things can change and how much you really have to look at every single guy in that room. And if nothing else, I think Darian Mensah has kicked a little bit of Ty and Kai's asses into gear, to be quite honest with you. I thought he had the best day out of all 3 guys last weekend at the scrimmage. And I know that all comes with the caveats of running with the 2s, running with the 1s. I know all that matters. And trust me, I have all that context. You just really you weren't seeing the command or the poise from those top 2 guys, but you were also seeing some pretty bad decision-making at times here and there. And that's a little worrisome when you're trying to look at kind of all those traits at once. So going into this weekend, I think, like I said, having this point system really helped out. And I'm trying to remember what it was. It was 3 points on the defensive side for a 3-and-out. They got 1 point if they had forced a punt, 1 point if it was a 4th down stop, 6 points for a turnover, 7 points if that's an interception. I like that the defense was able to score. Even though I'm not really going to go into that side of the ball that much on this episode, I will get into it on Thursday. It gave them, to me, an opportunity to kind of bite and make their case here. As I've said, previous scrimmages that I've seen with the Wave have had those 2 separate teams. They've had the depth to be able to do that. And so it's been, Michael Pratt's offense versus Kai Horton's offense in the past. That's not how this scrimmage worked. We saw Ty Thompson start with the 1s. We're not reading into the order of things. I think we've all gone through that. Kai Horton coming in with that as well. And then you had Darian Mensah running with the 2s. And so the defense started out kind of winning the day. And if you were someone that attended last week's scrimmage, that did get a little bit worrisome. The offense, the scoring was normal on their side of things. I think there were a few kind of trick play situations, but I don't think they really got into that. But, 3-and-out, 3 points. I think that's a good way to really get your defense going. And you saw them do that very quickly to start off the day. Kai Horton comes in, goes 3-and-out. Darian Mensah comes in, goes 3-and-out. Ty Thompson comes in, they get a 4th down stop. Same thing with Kai Horton following him. And so now the defense is up 8-0. I believe that was the only lead the defense ended up having for the day, just because it was very quickly quite easy for the offense to really be able to stack on top of that. You saw the first touchdown of the day go on a touchdown run from Arnold Barnes while Ty Thompson was in at quarterback. Then you saw Darian Mensah follow that up with a 13-yard touchdown to Bryce Bohannon, who really stuck out in this entirety of camp and seriously this spring game. And then Kai really quickly drove them down and got them to a field goal. I think that's really where you see Kai Horton's poise come out more than anything else, was in that moment for me. I'm going to kind of go through their play-by-play and break down what they were able to do. But once you saw the defense kind of start to make their case, I thought you saw all of the quarterbacks really start to build off of one another. And it kind of felt like a necessary infusion of competition for that matter. And they started to see some guys make some plays, and then they stepped it up on their following drive. Just compared to last week where we saw 7 total passes completed between the 2 guys starting for this race, the fact that we saw multiple touchdowns by the offense and saw a lot of answers kind of be made at that wide receiver role, enough to see some departures in the transfer portal today, it was a completely different showing than last weekend. So that's really what I'm going to focus on for the entirety of this episode, what that shows about the offense and what we've just kind of learned so far about this team, this coaching staff, and what we can look forward to this offseason. It's easy to hear a promo in the middle of a podcast and think, of course they like the product, they're paid too. Well, if you know me at all, then you know 2 things. 1, I'm truthful, almost to a fault. And 2, if I were in it for the money, I'd certainly be doing something else. So believe me when I say that I love Blue Oak Barbecue. The food, the drinks, the people, the location, yes, all of that. Blue Oak Barbecue has a great selection of your favorites, from the smoker, fantastic sides, and awesome bar specials each and every week. And we have something really exciting in the works coming out, I believe, next month. there at Blue Oak from the drink category. But in the meantime, go check them out. Blue Oak Barbecue, located at 900 North Carrollton Avenue here in New Orleans, or visit them online at blueoakbarbecue.com. And back again to these April specials. Monday, you stick to your classic with your red beans and rice. You got a chicken mole on Tuesdays. That looks really delicious just based on that picture. And then you keep it simple on Wednesday with the house smoked turkey sandwich with guacamole, arugula, and killer wheat bread. And that is definitely something that I am looking forward to trying over at Blue Oak for sure. So go get yourself some specials. Something that I think is important to just talk about in sports and life in general, just thinking about the way that you look and see the world, is biases and confronting our own biases, being aware of them. We hear about implicit biases a lot of the time. Having that psychology background is something I really try to be aware of. Confirmation bias is something that I kind of want to focus on here on today's show. And just again, the idea of covering a quarterback competition, giving everyone a real fair shot, and trying to kind of check yourself along the way. I learned, like I said, in my first experience covering a quarterback competition, that those types of biases are real. And you have to sometimes take a step back and think about whether or not you're kind of falling victim to them, with confirmation bias being something that you kind of ignore information that contradicts what you want your point to be, and you cherry pick the stuff that kind of fits into the way that you want to see things. So if you had an idea of a quarterback leading a race, or the guy that is your guy, for example, you're more inclined to look for the information that adds to that and confirms that it's your guy, and you're going to try to explain away some of the stuff that might not fit into that box. That's something that I just think everyone needs to be aware of as they really just think about the quarterback competition, how you're evaluating things in life in general. But what I think is just beyond important for these guys, and if we're going off of what this coaching staff is telling us, which anyone that has covered this team in these last couple of weeks so far it's just been very astonishingly upfront and open with needs, weaknesses, strengths, what have you, that when they say this is a true competition and it's one that's going to continue into the fall camp, I'm inclined to believe them for a lot of reasons, including my own eyes doing an eye check over the last few weeks. For me, it didn't really matter how well a guy did in this last spring game. They hadn't done enough up to that point for that game to really be a difference maker one way or the other. I think you probably wanted a little more out of both of those guys in a practice setting. But as I continue to remind people, there is just such an accumulation of information here with a new staff, all of these guys being in a new system. And when you're trying to learn all of that at the same time, try to find chemistry with the wide receivers, try to get your cadence down with a new center, with a new offensive line, one that's hurting quite a bit at tackle, which is something that this team is definitely going to have to address, all the while then trying to kind of become a leader. And I've talked about the fact that it is a little apparent that Ty Thompson seems to be a little more introverted. It actually has inclined me to pull out my book on introverts again called Quiet and read it again, just because that's something I kind of want to get into this offseason as well, is just what different styles of leadership can look like. But I think a lot of people expected Ty Thompson to come in here, his athletic traits, his ceiling to just really blow everything away. So he comes in, and first of all, he has to get an off-season procedure on his foot. So he's already behind the 8 ball on getting used to this team, that Kai Horton definitely has the edge in that aspect, as well as just being in critical game settings. And so he should have a little more of the edge at that point. And I think you saw that show here and there, especially during these scrimmages the last couple of weeks. But as I've continued to say, you've also seen both these guys make really bad decisions at time that you just don't want to see out of the guy under center. And if it was just the mistakes on the field and they were all being huge leaders, everything else was well-rounded, well, then that's easy. But you're kind of still trying to mold guys here. And so you're just not going to have them be well-rounded in all of those aspects. But you've definitely been missing the leadership of Michael Pratt, missing just what he brought to this offense, the command that he brings. And I think his presence being at the spring game on Saturday, it's hard to ignore. Just you want to be better when you're around a guy that is that good of a leader. And if you can even emulate an inkling of Michael Pratt, then you're already off in a better position. But coming off of Saturday's scrimmage, I have to shout out Kenzie Mitchell. She's been my intern with Hard in the Paint. She has been with me since this entire past season. Her note-taking is impeccable. her play-by-play notes have been beyond helpful for me because it just has kind of allowed me to get into a rhythm and get a sense of kind of the flow and uptick of this team and not have to worry so much about, the completed passes here and there. And so I was really kind of focusing on my eye check of the command of these quarterbacks. And as I said, to start off the day, it was primarily defense starting to win the day. You saw a few times where, there was a bobbled snap by Ty Thompson. And things just really weren't going that great to start off the day. You finally, like I said, you got that touchdown run by Arnold Barnes, and then Darian Mensah followed that up with a touchdown series himself. And then Kai Horton, who really hadn't been able to get that much going, all game, he really puts it into gear in the seventh series going into halftime, where they were actually simulating a 2-minute type situation that started running, and it was a 10-play drive. They had 3 first downs and a field goal, and they really did drive down the field. He got Mekhi Hughes involved out in space, then started getting Dante Fleming really involved, where if you ask me if there was a player of the game and someone who was really, proved me wrong in terms of making that real step that I was expecting him kind of to make in fall, but his trajectory has really moved up, and I just think he's been incredible throughout camp and was that real receiver of the day for me, with Bryce Bohannon really kind of following as a quick second there. We started playing those two guys off of each other. We've seen a lot of screen passes to these running backs out in space. And that's really what set up that field goal drive. For me, Kai Horton versus Ty. It's also hard for me because, again, at the end of the day, I'd like to give my opinions as open as I'd like to, but I still am the sideline reporter, and I'm also just aware that this is different than covering quarterbacks in the NFL who, as I said, are professional guys. These guys are still trying to chase their dreams and get on the field for the first time as a starter since high school. And so I'm not really here to just kind of pick them down and put them up side by side. It is weird. It's a weird position. I think Ty has the traits, and when it's clear for him and when you see it, it's really exciting. He has the legs, he has the athleticism, that mobility to really convert with his legs. We've seen all 3 quarterbacks, quite frankly, do it, but Ty Thompson's size just really sticks out. They all have really strong arms. Something you're not going to have to worry about this year with this team is whether or not they can launch it downfield. To me, it's going to be the decision-making and the command and the poise. And that really is something that you're going to really want to see them start to take control of heading into fall camp. But you really do see Kai Horton in these scrimmage settings really start to take that command and build and stack those drives on top of one another and be able to just execute and get his team moving down the field. And I saw more leadership from him on the sideline talking with Arnold Barnes after that touchdown drive, just doing a lot more off the field than we'd seen in the past. We just kind of saw that go back and forth throughout the day. And I've lost my train of thought as I'm trying to get through all this. And I'll be honest, I think Darian Mensah in the middle of a lot of these different drives, he was the one that put together a 14-play drive. It ended up being, I believe, I think he ran for 3 yards on a 4th down stop. But you could really see what he can do when he started to get the command going. And then Kai Horton just came out there and threw a beautiful pass to Dante Fleming that, went for about 80 yards. And it just shows how quickly Kai Horton can come out when the chips are down and just respond, really well. I thought he had the most well-rounded day out of the quarterbacks. Like I said, I think Ty Thompson has the traits and he has the ceiling, but Kai Horton, to me, had more consistency and a little bit more of that command coming out of that spring game. And that's, quite frankly, what you expect and where they should be at this point, where if Kai didn't have that command, it would be a red flag because he does have that more experience and he does have a little bit more just that familiarity with this team. But I think they really both made enough of a case for themselves. And no matter how you spin it in this quarterback competition, the offense is really going to dictate just how exciting this team really is going to be this year. It just continued to stick out to me that tight ends have been a primary involvement in this offense. And that's been with Alex Bauman being out. We saw Reggie Brown be the leading receiver in the first scrimmage, but we've seen them go past Reggie Brown and get Joshua Goins and Blake Gunter involved with all three quarterbacks to where it's not a throwaway. And you look at Joe Craddock's background, he's been a tight ends coach at UAB after being an offensive coordinator. And he said kind of coming in that they don't necessarily they thought they didn't have the personnel to be able to, run the tight end offense that they would like to, because tight ends in the way that you need them these days absolutely do not grow on trees. But we've really seen them make a case for those guys to get involved. And then it just opens everything else out. Defenses have to get big on tight ends. And so then you bring in those speedy receivers in Mario Williams and Keith Brown. And then all of a sudden you've really opened that up. And we saw them get the running backs involved out in space quite a bit as well. The running backs are just going to have so much easier of a day. But we've seen, it's been interesting because this is the second time that I've been covering a defensive-minded coach. And both offenses are set up with the predisposition to run the ball. But it did start to feel a little bit, like we were relying on Maddy Hudak and clock control to a degree last year. There was also just less depth at a lot of the positions that we're seeing this season, where you look back at the championship game and you had really good guys in Lawrence Keys, Chris Brazel, and Jaquan Jackson, but that room was not as deep as the room that we're seeing now. And so the offense really did kind of suffer at that point. But you're starting to kind of finally see, I think, that depth chart stick out with Mario Williams solidifying himself in this offense. Dante Fleming, in my opinion, changed his story completely and has just become a legit reliable catcher. Bryce Bohannon has been probably the MVP of all camp. If you look at how much he's connected with all of these receivers and you look back at the games that he's had to step in critical moments, he has just been, Jon Sumrall said a few weeks back, the wide receivers 3 through 4, 5, 6, it's not just about dynamic playmaking ability. It's about consistency and reliability and being able to stack those days. And I think that that's what you've seen the most out of him. Fat Watts has had one of the best comeback stories I've seen in a long time. And it's just his play on the field. He's taken that extra step that really reminds you of his brother in his body type, but also his physicality, and the way he just plays on the field is just different. And he has that hunger to him. Then you have Shaz Preston, who is not really built like a wide receiver, but has the speed of one. And that's going to be really exciting to watch him out in space. So you have thinner guys at wide receiver, but you also have these bigger guys too. I just think that you're going to see an offense that works a lot more as the sum of its parts than one that was required to kind of be led by a quarterback like Michael Pratt. And I do think that can just kind of happen when you're used to really good quarterback play being the case, that you can kind of get reliant on that as an offense. But no matter who ends up taking the place under center for this team, you can be rest assured that they're stretching the field vertically this year. They're stretching the field horizontally. And you have receivers that can beat guys in coverage. You just see Mario Williams in space and his separation, the quick moves he does off the line of scrimmage. It's just been really fascinating to watch. The running back room, I think we can all sleep well, rest assured there. I do know it took a hit today with Iverson Celestine entering the transfer portal. I will always remember how critical he was in that Kansas State win when Tajay Spears he was still a little bit in his head. He's very candid about that. I think he said he had 8 yards in that game. He did push Michael Pratt over the 4th yard line for the win, but we've seen almost so much excitement in this wide receiver room that now you are starting to kind of see what happens when you go through this spring game and you start to get an idea of things. We saw Jalen Griffin from UCF and Therese Trainer from Idaho both enter the transfer portal today for the Wave. It is a very crowded room, and I think it's one that we finally started to see shape out a little bit more. So I'm assuming that conversations were probably had there, and I've seen it going around that Kai Preen from LSU, that wide receiver, is expected to sign with Tulane. So reading the tea leaves there, I will wait until that's official to break that down, but it would make sense. And then you have a crowded running back room with, Mekhi Hughes, Arnold Barnes, that's your 1-2 punch. But then you have Shawty Clayton-Johnson. You have Trey Cornice that has come on strong. And so suddenly Iverson Celestine probably does feel like the odd man out in that aspect. And quite honestly, this team needs some scholarship spots to be able to address some of these needs, particularly at offensive tackle, where we saw one of the freshmen, RJ Whitehead, enter the transfer portal, who had been playing at offensive tackle for the last couple of weeks. That's going to be a position to watch. Trey Tuggle had been primarily running that role, and as we've kind of learned, he's suffered. We don't really know what the injury is, but the way that it's been talked about has not been great. And I'm not really expecting to see him to start the season next year, just based on kind of what we've heard. So that's a position where they really need to be attacking someone in the portal at this point. So you do kind of wonder what the conversations were there. But at the end of the day, you really have not seen that many key guys evaporate from Tulane. If anything, like I said, the interest, the recruits that were there, the potential transfers that are coming over, it's just really exciting. And that says a lot when you have these guys like Kai Preen from LSU coming over to look at this offense for Tulane, when you do have a defensive-minded head coach in Coach Sumrall. But I think there's two ways you can look at defensive-minded head coaches. You could see them as the old school guys, and sometimes that leads, to have a little bit of a lacking offense. You will often find them to be good culture, team builders, what have you. But defenses largely are, it's a chess match, and they have always been the ones that have had to evolve and react to the innovations on the offensive side of the ball. And I think about Jon Sumrall's age coming up as a defender and coming up in an era where it was a little more pass happy on the defensive side of things. And something I really want to get into on a later episode, especially probably the defense one that I'm going to get into this week, is his keep mentioning about how they're really going to be matching on defense based on the personnel of the offense. And that's a rarity in college football. You primarily see that in the NFL, but we usually see a team just kind of hang out in nickel more often than not. We kind of sometimes saw Tulane bring in 3 linebacker sets, but that's going to be a point of emphasis this year. But if you're a defense guy, you have to hire someone innovative on offense. And everything that we've seen about Joe Craddock, everything we've seen about the way that these plays have been called throughout spring camp shows that you really have the right person in the driver's seat in order to do that. And you saw all of these quarterbacks improve and show enough command this weekend that now the opportunity is theirs. There is no scheduled practice. They are, for all intents and purposes, on break. Do they work on their fundamentals? Do they start kind of working with their receivers? What work are they putting in this offseason? Just because there's not organized practices doesn't mean that these quarterbacks can't pull away from the race. And now they have an opportunity to perhaps get down some of the plays that they haven't gotten a good sense of and start to work with some of these guys on the depth chart that they think they're starting to kind of find that chemistry with. And you're starting to see those guys: Mario Williams, Shaz Preston, Yoel Keith Brown, Dante Fleming, Fat Watts, Bryce Bohannon. I'm sure I just missed several guys. And it's not just one quarterback connecting with the other and vice versa. It really is all across the board, and it's been extremely exciting to watch. But we are still in such the infant phases of following this new team and breaking down this spring game. I don't even feel like I really got to that much about it, just kind of talking about the identity and the feeling of this team. So this Thursday, I'll get into the defensive side of things. The quarterback competition is something that is just going to be something y'all are going to have to get used to continuing into the fall. And so I'm probably going to look into, some cases of quarterback competitions, what traits you really want to see in order to see that really pull through, how you can see leadership in a camp setting, and how you might see it come out in perhaps an unconventional way from a quieter guy. So all things considered, the first impression of the Jon Sumrall era from the Tulane community, I just truly am so blown away at what that support was like. I can't emphasize enough how much of a difference that makes for all of these guys and this team looking forward into this year. And it's good to see the fan base as juiced up as we are. And I will get back to more of the spring practice or the spring breakdown on this Thursday's episode. But as I said before, trying to keep it digestible so you guys can learn the most that you can about this Tulane team under the Jon Sumrall era. And with that, y'all, I will see you on Friday.